Hi, all. Thanks for joining me today. We are going to be addressing topic 2.5 in the APUSH curriculum, interactions between American Indians and Europeans. And I just want to start by saying that this is going to be really hard to fit into just like a 10 to 15-minute video. I hope that's how long it ends up because there's just so much here. It's kind of challenging to have a topic this broad in the curriculum, but hopefully I'll point you to some of the most important things that were going on during this time period between American Indians and Europeans. So to start, we always want to focus on our learning objective from the curriculum, explain how and why interactions between various European nations and American Indians changed over time. And then within that learning objective, we really have three different key concepts that the curriculum wants to focus on. Interactions between European rivals and American Indian populations fostered both accommodation and conflict. French, Dutch, British, and Spanish colonies allied with and armed American Indian groups who frequently sought alliances with Europeans against other American Indian groups. The second key point: British conflicts with American Indians over land, resources, and political boundaries led to military confrontations such as Metacom's War, also known as King Philip's War, in New England. And then third, American Indian resistance to Spanish colonizing efforts in North America, particularly after the Pueblo Revolt, led to Spanish accommodation of some aspects of American Indian culture in the Southwest. So those three concepts are really how I've outlined our lecture today. We're going to talk about the rivalries and alliances first, then a couple conflicts, and then the Spanish accommodation that happened after the Pueblo Revolt. So let's start with rivalries and alliances. So as you know from American history, is that initially Europeans were viewed as trading partners or military allies. And various American Indian groups are going to have different interpretations of that or different ways that that really happened. But those were generally kind of the initial views. For more specifics on each European power, like the Dutch, the English, the French, and the Spanish, you're going to want to check out video 2.2 to go into that a lot more. But basically what you need to know for this is that the different European motives for settlement did impact their relationships. So for example, the French were really focused on the fur trade. Well, because of the fur trade, they were very dependent on their American Indian allies. And because of that dependence, they ended up having to foster a much more positive relationship because they wanted it to maintain its the mutual benefits. Additionally, there were fewer settlers that came from the French. They were more likely to intermarry, which then created a mixed race of people. So that would just strengthen the bonds between the French and the American Indian allies. Whereas the Spanish were much more likely to enslave, force, force religious conversions, and so their relationship was much more tenuous. So anyways, those motives really impacted the different relationships. Additionally, as more and more migrations came, more land was taken, religion was forced upon American Indians even more, and then global conflicts ended up increasing those tensions and causing those relationships to change. Oftentimes, these rivalries and alliances are both centered on competition for land and resources. So, for example, again, the fur trade here, different American Indians tribes would have been primarily working to get the furs for European traders. And those American Indians then are in rivalry with each other as they're allied with different European powers. And those alliances would then impact the type of cultural diffusion that would take place. Some American Indian tribes became more fluent in French, while others became more fluent in English. Some were more likely to connect or become Catholic versus Christian. And so you can see how the alliances would then impact the cultures that developed and changed. But the alliances would shift as well. So if it became more beneficial for, say, the Huron to trade with the English, then they may shift their alliance temporarily or permanently as the relationship or as the benefits changed. And these new alliances really drew the Europeans into the American Indian ancient rivalries. So those rivalries were often over honor, living space, and captives, but the intensity of their warfare was really low by American standards, or by European standards, I should say, not American standards. Um, there were low death rates. They could be more called like a skirmish versus a massive war like Europeans were used to. And the results would often be tribes taken into captivity, um, or being adopted into families, and the number of captives was quite low. But the intensity and frequency of warfare really increased as less and less land and resources was available. That scarcity led to increased competition. The use of European weapons would drastically affect the number of casualties and the European expectations of war. So, as American Indians allied with Europeans, and Europeans were more used to annihilating entire groups of people, entire villages, the American Indians then changed the way that their warfare took place. So, this led to significantly more destruction and loss of life. So, moving away from rivalries and alliances, we do see two major conflicts happening in New England. There are other conflicts throughout the colonies, but the two kind of primary ones that you'll most often see in the AP curriculum are going to be the Pequot War and Metacom's War. So, some background on the Pequot War is that the continual land intrusions just continued to wear on those relationships. And it also was the religious intolerance of the Massachusetts Bay colonists. So, incredibly intolerant to non Puritan beliefs, forcing not only religious beliefs, but then also the behaviors associated with Puritanism, forcing that upon local Native Americans. And so the trading alliances ended up souring when an English captain was killed. That was blamed on the Pequot. And so then the English formed new alliances with the rivals of the Pequot, the Mohegans and the Narragansetts. So during this war, the English and their allied American Indians end up killing 400 Pequots, and an entire village ends up being annihilated. You can see that in the image I've included there, a drawing of what happened with the Europeans and their allies surrounding the Pequot village. They ended up setting fire to it, and as American Indians fled, they were shot. And so other Pequots then responded with attacks on English settlements, and really the slaughters that ensued were approved by Puritan leaders, thinking that they would say things like God had approved for them to do this because they deserved the land, because of their hard work and their piety. The Pequot survivors were then sold into slavery, and according to the Treaty of Hartford in 1638, the Pequot Nation was dissolved. And really, what this war demonstrates is the totality of European warfare, the complete annihilation, the stark difference between the way that ancient rivalries used to fight with small numbers of captives and small numbers of casualties. It really demonstrated a massive change in the type of warfare that was occurring within North America. Moving on to, here's a quote from a Pequot survivor. "We see plainly that their chiefest desire is to deprive us of the privilege of our land and drive us to our utter ruin." So now we'll move on to our second major war in New England, Metacom's War, also known as King Philip's War. So some background on this one is that Massasoit, who was a leader of the Wampanoag, had maintained a solid friendship with the Pilgrims. There were many in the Wampanoags who wanted to retaliate against Puritans and Pilgrims as they continued to take more and more land, or lied about treaties, those types of things. But Massasoit maintained that friendship. But in the 1660s, we see some things changing. The settlements continued to grow, and the distance between the Wampanoag and Plymouth grew closer and closer. And there was a new generation of leaders. Metacom, who was also known as King Philip by the English, he was Massasoit's son, and then some of the other leaders of the Pilgrims. They're just new leaders that didn't have the basis for that positive relationship. The forced conversions, implementations of English laws and customs were increasing during this time, so much so that they actually created praying towns. This is where American Indian converts would be resettled when they adopted Christianity. And they really ended up living kind of this life in between. They weren't completely accepted by the English, and they were definitely criticized or not trusted by American Indians. So these praying towns were developing, and there was just rumors between the Wampanoag and the English, wondering whether war was going to take place. And John Sassamon, who was a praying Indian, confirmed these rumors to the English and then later was found dead. And so the English authorities end up believing they found the three Wampanoag who completed the murder. And so then they hang those three American Indians. So then the war is imminent as a retaliation for the execution of the three Wampanoag. So the English begin to flee the settlements. Wampanoag do burn the abandoned homes. Entire towns were burned. Catastrophic casualties, including the Great Swamp Fight, where 300 men were killed of the Narragansett, even though they were neutral in this war. And then they ended up burning alive another 300 women, children, and elderly. So just complete annihilation. In 1675 to 1676, especially that winter, the outcome was pretty unclear. But by the summer, the Wampanoag were running low on supplies. Some of their Native American allies had actually shifted to the English side as the English tried to incentivize them with various benefits. And so in August of 1776, Metacom is killed. And this is what kind of ends the war. His head ends up being displayed on a pole for the next 20 years in Plymouth. About 1,000 American Indians were sold into slavery, including Metacom's wife and son. And so here you can see some of the statistics of the population, about 5,000 total deaths out of a population of 70,000. And that percentage is higher than any other American conflict. And so this war really devastated American Indians populations in the region, and really they lost power. Many ended up moving west towards the Appalachian and being absorbed into other American Indian groups. But it really decimated the presence of American Indians in this area. Here's a quote by John Easton. He's governor of Rhode Island, and he wrote on kind of on behalf of the American Indians. And it is a little bit long, but I shortened it so much. It really shows kind of the grievances of the American Indians and why King Philip's War happened. They said they had been the first in doing good to the English, and the English were the first in doing wrong. They said when the English first came, their king's father was a great man, and the English as a little child. He constrained other Indians from wronging the English, and gave them corn, and showed them how to plant, and was free to do them any good, and he had let them have 100 times more land than now the king has for his own people. Another grievance: the English cattle and horses still increased, that when they removed 30 miles from where the English had anything to do, they could not keep their corn from being spoiled. They never being used to fence, and thought when the English bought the land of them, they would have kept their cattle upon their own land. We knew before these were their grand complaints, but then we only endeavored to persuade that all complaints might be righted without war. We endeavored that however they should lay down the war, for the English were too strong for them. They said then the English should do to them as they did when they were too strong for the English. So this is kind of a list of grievances that the Wampanoag had. There were many more things included in this entire passage. but basically demonstrating that during the time of Massasoit, the American Indians, the Wampanoag, could have eliminated the English, but didn't. They were kind to them. And now the English have the power, and the Wampanoag are asking for the same kindness to be given to them, which obviously did not happen. All right, last topic today is the Spanish accommodations. So, review here is that the Spanish were the first to really settle the New World, the first Europeans to have permanent settlements. And their colonization was really focused on conquest, gold, and slavery. You can see period 1 videos for a lot more details about that. But in the Spanish settlements, we see incredibly high death rates for American Indians and forced conversions to Catholicism. And so this leads up to the Pueblo Revolt, another conflict, but very different from the Pequot Wars and Metacoms War, in that it's successful for American Indians. It was a very well-planned attack. There were alliances with the Pueblo and other American Indian groups in the area. A huge destruction of churches and deaths of priests. And what ended up happening is that the Spanish ended up being removed from the region for about 12 to 14 years. It took them quite a bit of time to end up retaking back the area. And we're talking about the American Southwest here. So here's responses about why American Indians engaged in this rebellion. The people were tired of the work they had to do for the Spaniards and the clergy who did not allow them to plant to do things for their own needs. And the Spanish had tried to take away the ways of their ancestors, the faith by which they have lived and thrived. So, kind of twofold purpose here. One is the enslavement, thus forced subjugation, and the second piece would be the religious conversions. So, what's the impact of this Pueblo Revolt is that we see, especially the religious side, the religious conversions kind of taking a back seat, and the Pueblo being able to return to life in some ways to how it was before European colonization. Obviously, the epidemics of disease that had spread had completely changed their populations. However, they were free from some of that European influence. The next Spanish governors who do come in and take over, in that 12 to 14 years later, end up being forced to make some compromises. So they accommodate some of the requests of the Pueblo instead of that, tight rule with an iron fist that was taking place before. So the Pueblo were able to maintain a lot of their religious customs even 15 years later. Okay, so that was a lot, but hopefully you learned a little bit and have a good understanding of this learning objective, how and why interactions between various European nations and American Indians changed over time. Please like and subscribe if you can, and please let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer any further things that you have for me.